Symphony No. 5 in C minor, movements 1 through 4 by Ludwig van Beethoven. Let's take a careful look at the following details that are indicated in the title: the genre, the significance of the number, and the movement number itself. Since this work is a symphony, we know that it was composed for concert use, it is scored for orchestra, and it has 4 movements. Make sure you know these details for the other movement formats, the sonata, the string quartet, and the concerto. That is, make sure that you know their cultural context, domestic or concert, their performing forces, and also the number of movements in each of these genres. This is Symphony No. 5 of the composer's total output of symphonies, and it should be very easy for you to associate this symphony, Symphony No. 5, with the composer in this unit who wrote only 9 symphonies, Ludwig van Beethoven. Now we're going to examine and hear the entire symphony, and you will see that the situation with the movement formats represented in it and their positions is not quite so simple as those that we have seen in the movements from the 2 symphonies that we examined earlier in this unit, the 1 movement from the Mozart symphony and the 3 movements from the Haydn symphony. Indeed, if you take a look at the table here, you will see that the first and the last movements of this composition are both cast in sonata allegro format. You already know that sonata allegro is always used for the first movement of the multi-movement genres that we are considering in this unit. And we also know that it can be used for any other movement as well. And here we see it used for the 4th movement of the work. The second movement of the work, as we shall see, uses the typical second movement format, that is theme and variations. But the third movement does not use any of the movement formats we've looked at before. It is a new movement format based on the typical third movement format that I described for you earlier. Although there are many good reasons to examine this work in its entirety, there is one work detail that is particularly noteworthy. That is, this work is unified by a 4-note rhythmic motive. By unified, I mean that it is made one. That is, the composer has made an effort to relate all of the movements to one another, and he has done so by presenting a single musical idea, in this case a 4-note rhythmic motive, in each of the 4 movements. Basically, he states this idea at the beginning of the symphony, and you hear it again and again in each one of the movements, so they all seem to be somehow connected to each other and therefore made one. The rhythmic motive, represented here as short, 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 long, is one that you're all familiar with. Short, 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 long. Short, 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 long. Ba-ba-ba-bom. 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 Surely you've all heard this 4-note motive before, and you've heard the melody that I just sang for you. So let's examine each movement in turn, and as we do so, let's identify how the motive is manifested in it, and let's take a look at any other outstanding features of the movements as well. Let's begin by examining the first movement of this composition. The 4-note rhythmic motive is heard right at the beginning of the movement, and it is heard in the first theme. Ba-ba-ba-bom. Ba-ba-ba-bom. There are 2 interesting details of this movement that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first of them is one that occurs in the recapitulation. Beethoven seems to have been intent on surprising and baffling his audience in this symphony, and he certainly does so with an element that he introduces into the recapitulation. that review of the theme or the themes that occurs in a sonata allegro format movement. And here he presents a feature that one normally associates with a concerto or with an operatic aria, that is a cadenza. And you can imagine how surprising it must have been for the very first audience of this composition to have heard this work. The orchestra is moving along, reviewing the themes just as it is supposed to in the recapitulation, when all of a sudden all the instruments stop playing except for an oboe. And the oboe slowly plays a cadenza. And then the orchestra resumes the movement as though nothing had happened whatsoever. Also interesting is what happens in the coda of this composition. You already know that a composer can do whatever he wants to in the coda of a work, and here the composer introduces a brand new theme and he presents it in counterpoint. So this is one of those contrapuntal accent sections that you will hear in classical movement formats. The second movement of this work also gives us something to think about. In this movement, the rhythmic motive, short, 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 long, is stated in the B part of the theme, or what is called theme 2 in your listening outline. They amount to the same thing. And here it's quite clear that the composer actually wants you to take notice of this fact, that the 4-note motive is represented in the theme, because it's presented at first very quietly, and then it is blasted out in the brass instruments. Bom ba bom 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 ba bom 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 bom. And it's very clear that he really wants you to hear that. It's really clear that he wants to let everyone know that he has in fact unified this symphony by using that motive again in this movement. Another interesting element of this movement is its very long transitions. This is heard at the very beginning in the theme. The theme, when you listen to it, seems almost not to end. It seems to keep going on and on and on. And every so often, when you think that the theme has finally ended, it continues for a moment. And then it continues again until it finally comes to a conclusion. And you hear the same sort of thing happening at the very end of the composition. When you listen to the coda, there are a number of occasions on which the music sounds as though it is going to stop and the movement is going to conclude at that moment. But then he cranks up the music and keeps it moving for a little while longer. It's quite evident that Beethoven was intent on entertaining his audience in this symphony by keeping them on their toes. The third movement of this composition presents us not with a minuet in trio format, as you could absolutely expect to find in a classical symphony, but rather with a scherzo and trio movement format. I've already pointed out to you that Haydn, like other classical composers, sometimes poked fun at this movement format. And here Beethoven makes the joke explicit. In fact, he calls this movement a scherzo in trio. The word scherzo itself means joke. It basically has the same plan as a minuet in trio movement, A, B, A prime. And A prime is A prime because it's A presented without repeats. But the music is lighter and faster than that is used for a minuet. And this movement format was invented by Beethoven, and once he introduced it, other composers followed his example, and by the end of the century, it was the standard movement format for a 4-movement symphony.